Hello, and welcome to Mystic Dog Mama, the podcast for soul led dog mamas, where you'll discover how to best nourish your dog and yourself, mind, body, and soul. I'm your host, Dr. Alexia Meller. Hello, hello. Thank you so much for being here with me today. It's wonderful to be bringing you some more interviews after our recent summer series. I'm going to be continuing to do a mix of solo episodes and interviews on different topics that you want to know more about so that I can both answer your questions and bring on guests to help better support you in all of the different aspects of this journey that we're on with our dogs. So again, I always encourage you to reach out to me on Instagram at Mystic Dog Mama, or you can contact me via my website, which is mysticdogmama.com, and let me know what you're enjoying and what questions you have about things like feeding your dog or about energy healing and all that good stuff. And if you have any special guests you want me to reach out to, let me know. It's definitely my intention to continue fostering this beautiful community that we're creating together and have a safe, judgment-free space to explore what it means to nourish our dogs, to nourish ourselves. And that means helping bring some support with the things that you're struggling with or are just curious about. So let me know. In this week's episode, I chat with Beth Bigler of Honoring Our Animals. Beth is a pet loss grief counselor who is offering a really important and valuable space for us to explore the various kinds of grief that we will inevitably experience in our lives, especially when we invite our four-legged beloveds into our lives. Beth and I have one of the most important conversations that I actually think I've had around the topic of grief, and especially of our culture's complete avoidance of the grieving and mourning experiences, and then how we can transform with and through the process of honoring our animals and honoring ourselves. This is not a sad conversation, don't worry, but it is a validating one. We talk about all different kinds of grief, whether that's the grief we feel around not having the kind of dog we thought we would have, or the grief of feeling like we're not a good enough pet parent, as well as the grief of anticipating our pet's passing, and the grief that we feel when they have crossed over. Beth shares so many helpful tips, and she speaks from personal experience because it was her own experience of seeing a pet loss grief counselor when her beloved cat Arnie was passing from cancer that actually catapulted her into this work. Beth also shares how her relationship with Arnie has really continued to grow and deepen, even as he's on the other side. So whether you're currently experiencing grief, whether you did in the past and didn't feel supported, or whether you're wanting to know how to support another who is in the grieving process, or whether you just want to know more ways to deepen your relationship with your pet in life and on the other side, this is such an impactful episode. And I hope that it helps create the space here in this community to honor, to recognize, and to hold space for us all as we experience the big emotions that we have in our lives. Stick around until the end because I'm putting together some resources for supporting us through these kinds of things, and I want to hear from you about what you would find helpful. Okay, on that note, let's go. Hi, Beth. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Mystic Dog Mama podcast. I'm so excited for today's conversation.
Likewise, it's a thrill to be here. I'm really eager to dive into this topic with you.
Excellent, excellent. And I think this is a topic that is a little bit taboo in our society. And I think a lot of people are kind of afraid to talk about issues like grief and pet loss and all of the stuff that comes along with that. And I'm really, really excited to create a safe space today to explore what that looks like, to explore different ways that we can process those big emotions that we experience, because it's kind of inevitable when we bring something into our lives that we love so much that there's always that both possibility and probability that there are going to be aspects of grief to that relationship. And so I think it's really important to kind of highlight that as something that we want to be talking about rather than something that we want to be avoiding. So I'm really excited for today.
Likewise, this is huge. Any kind of grief around our animals is still a disenfranchised grief, which means that it's not a grief that is often openly acknowledged or socially recognized, publicly supported, or even, validated in any way. And particularly, grief while our beloveds are still alive is even more disenfranchised in a way. So this is a huge area where we can all learn more, do better, be better, and remove stigma around this type of grief. So I'm so happy that you're talking about it.
Oh, I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled. And I was telling you before we started recording that a large part of the Mystic Dog Mama audience has complex dogs, whether that be reactivity or other forms of behavioral issues or health issues, various challenges. And the thing is like those dogs are really special in terms of being guides for us in our journeys. And actually the quote unquote problems that they present for us are real opportunities for us to do a lot of the inner work and to really ask what is the wisdom in this kind of experience. But again, there's a lot of grief that goes alongside that we don't necessarily know how to process. So
Hmm.
that I just want to let listeners know that we are going to be talking about some of that today, because I think that particular group of pet parents really struggles with a whole lot of things, and this is an
Yeah,
aspect where we absolutely need support and didn't, I personally didn't even know that there were outlets for that. So it's really exciting to be able to present various outlets for dealing with the complex emotions that come along with your complex dog.
completely. And, even when, and because I am a big believer, now I'm a pet loss grief counselor, that is my calling in life. So I do believe that in grief, we have tremendous opportunity. And there are gifts that come from all kinds of grief. There are transformations that come from grief. And it's really hard and it really stinks. And there's so many aspects to it that are just brutal and devastating and wrenching. And, there's always this fine line too of, if you are someone who wants to find the opportunity and find the wisdom and find the lesson, that stuff is all excellent. And I love that. But, and I don't use but very often, I use and mostly, but we also want to create space to let our grief be expressed, to let our grief be heard, to let our grief be validated, and to also be able to own the hard parts. And that's a really delicate balance when you have a complex dog and grief surrounding it.
Oh, 100%, 100%. I think especially in the kind of spiritual communities, there's a lot of kind of talk around ignoring the human experience. It's, that kind of reminder that we're spiritual beings having a human experience. It's like, yeah, but we're having a human experience and we're meant to have the human experience. We're meant to feel the human emotions and go through all of that. But
Yeah,
when you are doing it through a spiritual lens, what I find helpful about that is that you don't necessarily get so sucked into the human experience that you forget that this is happening for a greater purpose in your life. But again, it's that both and, right? You can't ignore the fact that this stuff is hard. This stuff is
totally.
hard. And we need to
Yeah.
create spaces where we're supporting one another through it, because something that I talk about all the time on the podcast is the need for community. And I think that
Hmm.
in our culture, and particularly in the West, where we are so focused on the individual and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and having to deal with all your own problems and all of that, that we can sometimes take these big emotions on and feel like we've got to fix it ourselves. We got to handle it ourselves. And the
Yeah.
reality is these sorts of experiences are meant to be had in community and supported by community. So I'm really
Yeah.
excited that there are opportunities for people to connect with people like you that actually are
Yeah.
providing that service of support that is so desperately
Yeah.
needed.
Yeah, completely agree on the community thing. And obviously, I see that on my Instagram all the time. There's these beautiful conversations happening with people all over the world who are coming together, feeling supported. And actually, community has become mandatory for the people I work with in my grief counseling practice. Whether you're working with me one on one or in a small group, I have a whole platform away from social media that is just a private community only for people who are working with me so that they can be in a very safe, moderated space to express and be seen and heard, and to be around other people who are experiencing similar things. Every grief experience is very different, right? And the circumstances and all the different events around our griefs are completely different. However, we have so much in common, and it is so powerful to be able to reach out to others, to hear other people's stories, and to kind of be in it together.
Mm.
So yeah, grief and community are basically hand in hand or paw in paw in my book.
I love that. I love that so much. Beth, could you talk to us a little bit about how you even went down the road of grief counseling? What brought you into this work?
Well, I was not, a little kid saying, "Oh, I'd love to grow up and become a pet loss grief counselor with my life." That was not a thing. I was an artsy kind of kid. I was very focused on theater and writing, and I actually became a professional writer when I was 18 years old, and worked in theater and film and television throughout a very long career. My biggest part of my career is creating and selling TV shows, so I was definitely not set out to become a grief counselor, but my soulmate, Arnie, when he was only 11 years old, received a really devastating prognosis on a pretty unusual cancer. And all of a sudden, my world just stopped. I couldn't imagine living in a world without Arnie in it. I couldn't imagine helping him die. That seemed absolutely incomprehensible. And I didn't care really about surviving any of that. And that's when I knew, hey, I need help. I need some help here. Mostly at the time because I wanted to be able to show up for him and be a good support to him. I kind of didn't really care what even happened to me because I was just so devastated. I couldn't imagine it. It really came out of nowhere. So I found an incredible pet loss grief counselor myself, and I started working with her on anticipatory grief. And immediately I could notice a difference and a change, and my relationship with him started getting even more understanding between us, and our the way I understood him and who he was in my life became so much more clear, and that was very helpful as we were dealing with all the other things. And we tried an experimental chemo. We did kind of a Hail Mary chemo and we got a remission, which was incredible. But even with the remission, I kept going to see my pet loss grief counselor because I was like, this work is so incredible. I had done every kind of therapy. I've done hypnosis. I've done every kind of thing, you can do therapeutically. And I was like, this is the best therapeutic work I've ever done. Why is it so good? So I actually kept going to see her and I was really drawn to the work and really loved what it was unlocking in me and in my relationship with Arnie. And I then had an opportunity in an emergency clinic. I was at a regular oncology checkup for Arnie, but the emergency vet was part of that practice. And I was waiting for my appointment and met a woman next to me whose cat had ingested lily water. And lilies are very toxic for cats. And her cat was only 3 years old, and they were going to have to euthanize the cat. And she was so guilty and she was so distraught. And I just started talking to her. I held her hand, started listening. Um, I ended up, my husband came and took Arnie to his appointment. I ended up staying with her, stayed the day, stayed for the euthanasia, and helped her get home afterward. And I knew then, I was like, oh, this is what I want to do. I just felt very called in that moment. But then I thought, well, I'm busy. I'm working. I can't do it now. Maybe when I retire is kind of what I thought. And then just a few short months later, unfortunately, Arnie developed another cancer that was not present in his ultrasound or blood work 2 weeks before, but it came on very rapidly and overtook his whole body, and there was nothing we could do. And so I had about 4 days from the time that he had a symptom to when we had to euthanize. And so that was a total blindside. And I was able to give him a good death because of the anticipatory work I had done. And as soon as it happened, I sort of decided, why would I wait to do this work? Now this is something Arnie and I are going to do together. We're going to help people and start changing the conversation about human animal bond and grief. And so I moved through my experience with Arnie with good support, and then started my training and finished my training, opened my practice, and here I am doing this full time with Arnie as my guide in the work.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. That's such a beautiful
Sure.
story. That's really beautiful. And it's nice to hear that beautiful things come out of really difficult situations as well. Yeah. Oh my goodness. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you define grief as well, because I think that it's an important it's an important thing to do, especially with I had mentioned to you previously that I feel like things like grief and trauma, we tend to allow other people to have, and we
Mm,
kind of have empathy around other people having them, but we don't necessarily recognize the griefs and the traumas for ourselves or in our own lives, or allow ourselves the space to even acknowledge that they exist. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you define grief, what that looks like.
yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the questions I'll often ask people when I'm working with them is, what do you know about grief? What do you know about mourning? Who taught you about what grief is? What did grief look like in your family? I mean, in my family, somebody died. We buried them. Everyone cried for a day and we never talked about it again. Right? That was what I knew about grief pretty much. So I think it's always an interesting leaping off point if you are experiencing grief or you think you're experiencing grief. It's like, take note, like, who are my grief role models? How did I see grief expressed or not expressed? When I was a little kid, I was at my grandmother's funeral and I was 7 and I knew she was dead and I knew what that meant. And when I went up near her casket and I wanted to touch her hand, I just wanted to kind of like say goodbye. And I went to do that. And one of my aunts came over, my great aunt came over and slapped my hand really hard. It was loud. I remember it very clearly because we were not a kind of family that would ever lay hands. And I know I got a message then, you know, not okay. Do not interact, do not touch, right? So, one thing is we're all carrying around messages. We're all carrying around stuff about grief that we might not even know that we're carrying. That's a great point of exploration for
Mhm.
people. In terms of what I think about what grief is, and of course, there's lots of different definitions. I sort of think of grief like a constellation. It's a constellation made up of many stars, and those are different thoughts and feelings that we have on the inside when we're going through something, right? Mourning is sort of the outward expression of those thoughts and feelings. So sometimes we think about mourning as like grief gone public. And I always like to mention grief and mourning together because you can be grieving, but not outwardly expressing it or having a way to express it. And it's powerful and important to be able to also express and mourn when you're grieving. And of course, what comes up in grief, I mean, there's all kinds of experiences, there's a huge range. But for many people, depending on what it is, and this goes for grief over living animals and current events that are happening and also post loss, but a level of shock, disbelief, discombobulation, confusion. That's brain stuff because our brains are deeply affected. Physical symptoms. We often have a lot of physical symptoms. We have big, strong emotions like guilt and regret, questioning, yearning, longing, sadness, relief, release, all kinds of big, huge feelings that are going on. So, I think we want to consider when we are grieving that we have a huge range of feelings. Many people feel grief is like a roller coaster, right? Because it's one thing to the next. You can be up, you can be down, you can be laughing, you can be crying. And one thing I think is very powerful to remind ourselves is grief doesn't look one type of way. Like, not everybody cries a lot in grief. It doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. Not everybody gets super angry in grief. Doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. So there's also like a lot of assumptions we make about how we are supposed to be grieving or what it should look like. And we got to really watch the word should at all times in our lives, but especially in grief, because there really is no one way that is correct to grieve and experience grief. And that's something that a lot of the people I work with struggle with. They think they're doing it wrong. They call me and they say, I think I'm doing it wrong. Can you help me do it right? I'm like, there is no right.
You're
And that's a
right.
huge thing to release when you're grieving.
Yeah. And I think that's what actually one of the gifts of the process of grieving is helping us to release that in our lives more generally,
Yeah.
because I think it's something that whole thing of having to be right, having to be perfect, having to do things in a certain way, it's just absolutely detrimental. And I find that even like you were talking about grief while the animal is alive, something that comes up more times than I can count with clients that I work with is I'm often working, especially in the nutrition space, with dogs that have complex issues going on. There's behavioral issues, there's food issues, there's all kinds of stuff. There's history of trauma for the dog, etc.
Yeah.
And the pet parent is having to deal with all of this stuff at once and often on their own. And I think, again, speaking about community, like this is part of the issue is they're trying to handle all this stuff alone.
Yeah.
And I've had a number of clients in tears with me saying, I just don't want to fail the dog. I feel like I'm failing. I feel like I should be doing more. It should look differently. And I noticed that a lot of what they are kind of going through is actually a form of grief in
Yes.
terms of that kind of measuring against the dog that they thought they were getting and the owner they thought they should be, what that looks like, that picture, that idealized form versus the reality of their day to day. And whether they're conscious of it or not, they're constantly judging themselves against that.
Yes.
And all of a sudden it's like it just comes out and they don't know what to do with it. They don't know where to place that. And so I think, yeah, kind of talking about some of those like smaller ways that we experience grief too is just so important in the day to
Yes.
day.
Yes. Well, and not to mention, I mean, something you're bringing up there too is this comparison. And of course, for those of us who have loud inner critic voices, which many people do, and for the, yep, self included, and for those of us who have very high standards for themselves and high expectations, and, people who are coming to work with you or work with me, they are very active, engaged guardians for their dogs. And they are the people that are going to try everything and uncover new ways to stimulate and train and educate and if there's medication and if there's behaviorists. I mean, these are the people that are going to be doing everything. And when you're someone like that and then you feel like it's just quote not working, of course you have feelings of failure coming up. Or now we get into looking at what other people are doing. And Instagram has been very good to me. I
Yeah.
appreciate the platform I have there. However, it really can stir up feelings of comparison and shoulding, and why is that working for them and not for me, and what am I doing wrong? And we always assume that we are to blame. And now we learn that young in some of our families of origins. And we very rarely step back to say, what if this isn't about me? What if this has to do with my dog's family of origin or my dog's genetics or my dog's underlying medical stuff, right? We are so quick to place the blame on ourselves. And that is a grief loop that gets stuck for people, regardless of what the grief is about. And that gets you real stuck and can be hard to break out of, especially when you're trying to be present and available and connecting with your beloved. That's
Mhm.
a huge challenge.
Oh, absolutely. And what you were just saying there reminded me of something that Don Miguel Ruiz says in the Four
Mm,
Agreements of
yes.
like always doing your best and reminding ourselves that our best is constantly fluctuating and it's context dependent. And I think the problem in many respects with our culture is that we always assume the best is like 100% performance. Like when you're told to do your best as a child or whatever, it's like you're supposed to be exceptional, but doing your best today might be like you got out of bed. You know what I mean? Like that might, if
Yeah.
that might actually be the best that you could have done, or like brushed your teeth,
Yep.
and it's being conscious of that, and it's
Yeah.
being really loving to ourselves in every circumstance that we're in, and really adjusting our expectations, I think is a huge part of this.
Huge, huge. Yes. I mean, the number one, if I could give any person experiencing grief about anything related to their beloved or to their life, it would be the gift of self compassion. And I would say, anyone who's listening who's struggling with a complex dog, please start a self compassion practice, because that's one of the number one things you can do to help yourself through this. Because the expectations that you have for yourself are likely unrealistic, and they are likely not fair. And they're also not expectations you would have for another person. You wouldn't talk to a friend like that. So why are you talking to yourself like that? And a big piece of those expectations too often has to do with many of us feel safer when we feel like we can control outcomes. We get a huge feeling of safety when we feel like, well, it's all on me because I can make it happen and I don't have to count on other people, or I don't have to believe the universe can just make bad things happen. So for a lot of people, we get really bogged down and it's all on me because we want to be able to control it. It makes us feel safer. And sometimes when we have a situation like a complex dog, we feel like a lot of stuff is out of our control because we don't know exactly what's going on, or we don't know what the perfect solution will be. I'm putting that in quotes for those of you who are listening. um, and we don't know exactly how to quote fix it. And so we can start to feel very powerless and very afraid and feeling like we don't have any control. And then we double down by finding new ways to have more control. And that is another kind of loop that happens. And so some of those expectations are also just wrapped up in like wanting that control and
Mm.
feeling guilty when we don't have a crystal ball to know. Because so many people are like, well, if I had known that at 9 months my dog was going to start kind of changing behavior, I would have done everything differently as a puppy. Well, you didn't know for starters. And you probably were doing a lot of great things as a puppy, right? There's not always ways to prepare or prevent certain complexities from
Yeah.
beginning. But again, back to our desire for control.
Exactly, exactly, and I know we talk about the gift of hindsight, but I also think it's a curse in that kind of situation where it sets unrealistic expectations because how could you possibly know? And maybe, coming again from that kind of bigger picture spiritual lens, who says you were supposed to know? That idea that, like, we can avoid all problems is actually part of the problem, that, again, there's real wisdom that comes on the other side of all of this kind of stuff. I remember a friend of mine and I talking about when we were both in some really difficult kind of personal situations and feeling like you were just sort of like experiencing the flames of fire all the time, right? Like no matter where you turned, it was like, oh my God, this is just unbelievable. But coming to the point where, and this is again is the gift of community, that my friend and I were not necessarily at the same point with our stuff at the same time. So we could help one another through this.
Yes.
And what was happening was that we were guiding one another to see that it's walking through the fire that the
Hmm.
transformation on the other side exists. So you have to actually go through that. You can't like circumvent it. You can't just kind of walk around it or, jump over it or whatever.
Yeah.
We can't avoid it. We've got to go through it. But when we're in those tough moments, it's really hard to see that and feel that and accept that. And we can rally against it and be like, no, I don't want to have to do this. But having somebody that can completely hold you when you're feeling all of that and totally acknowledge that that is so normal to feel and help pull you through it. And you get to the other side and you can see things in a way that you didn't see them before. And so reframing that kind of hindsight of it should have
Yep.
looked a certain way. I should have said this. I should have done that. I even hear it from the nutrition space of like, I should have started feeding them a better food earlier on. It's
Yes.
like,
Yep.
none of that's helpful. None of it's helpful. And that doesn't even mean that your dog wouldn't have gotten sick. Like this idea that we can somehow avoid the experiences of life
Yeah.
via, a blueberry or something like that is just
Yeah.
totally false. And it sets
Yeah.
really false hopes and expectations for people.
Yeah. Yeah, 1,000%. And the the way that our kind of guilt brain or critical voice get together and say things like, well, if I had just fed the food, the cancer wouldn't have come. It totally negates all the other branches on the tree that would have had to also all those other choices and things that may or may not have anything to do with nutrition. The blueberries do not always stop the cancer, right? And we don't even know, right? So it is kind of this thinking, this distorted thinking that comes when we so desperately want to control an outcome. And something that's very helpful for a lot of my clients, I mean, it's just a very simple phrase, but I say it to myself quite frequently whenever I have like a big question about, well, why didn't that happen? Or why is this happening? Or, the big spiritual whys is I just like to put my hands over my heart and just say, well, that answer is not for me to know at this time.
Mm.
That's very comforting. That answer is not for me to know at this time. And that helps me kind of turn it over.
Yeah, I also love the hand on the heart because there's real power too in like that physical feeling and that kind of putting that pressure on the body and reassuring the nervous system. Like we're not meant to know everything. We're really
That's
not.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
Tactile interaction with your body and with other objects is super important during grief. It's one of the most overlooked areas of grief. Another exercise like that I really love when you're having some of that spiritual questioning or having things that are kind of beyond your control. I have mine right here. Actually, I wasn't planning to talk about it, so it's under something. This is my universe box. Some people call it a God box. Have you ever heard of these? This is so helpful. And you just keep your little universe box. Mine is orange because Arnie's signature color is orange, but you can have any vessel you want. It can be a jar, it can be a vase, whatever you want to use. And I keep a little stack of post-it notes next to it. And whenever I have a question or something I'm not going to get the answer to because it's above my pay grade, or something I just kind of want to release or turn over or surrender to, I write it on the post-it note. I crumple it up really tight. If you're watching, you can see this. That's the best part. You just crumple it up super duper tight into these little tiny balls, and then stick it into the universe box or the God box, whatever you like to call it, goddess box, and then close it up. And then I've put it there. And that's another tactile action that we can
Mhm.
take, not only to release the thought or feeling, but physically do something with it, just
Mhm.
like when we put our hand over our heart. And grief is so overwhelming sometimes that when we do tactile things to release and validate it, it really adds a layer on top of just the emotional expression.
Oh, definitely. Oh, I love that so much. I love the God box idea as well. I think it's so important to
Yeah.
have those kind of little rituals
Yes.
that you're creating. And I think too, like with the tactile stuff, there are two things that I think are really important, especially when it comes to pet loss, is that first of all, we often go to our pets for that tactile experience. You know, we love on them and we pet them and we're used to that. And then all of a sudden, that
Yeah.
little being isn't there. And our source of like physical connection in many respects is gone. And so having to find
Yeah.
something to substitute because we become very aware of that missing piece in
Yes.
our lives. But also we store emotions in our bodies.
Yes.
So we have to create ways to get that out, to move that out. So I love that idea of like creating even small little tactile things that you can be
Yes.
transferring that energy, releasing so it doesn't get stuck in the body and other
Yes.
outlets to kind of support our very human need to touch. Yeah.
Totally. And in sort of later grief, right? Not that grief has a timeline, but sometimes in later grief, it's easier for us to go and chop wood or break dishes or go to a rage room or scream underwater and like do kind of bigger physical expressions to release. But in early grief, that's very hard because you can like barely get out of bed or not get out of bed. So I'm always looking for those smaller kind of micro movements. And in so many ways, if you just start doing them, incorporating them into your day, like I love, I encourage people to have little photographs, little small photographs by the door. So when they come and go, they're still saying goodbye, they're saying hello. But I say, touch the photograph, touch that
Mm.
photograph when you go. Or if you have a photo on your fridge, touch the photo when you say hello or goodbye. Or if you're walking by their bed and you want to place your hand on their bed and give an I love you when you touch the bed, as many tactile interactions as you can have when you're connecting with your beloved is so good for grief and so good for that little release, especially when you don't feel like doing some of the bigger kind of physical releases that can be super helpful, but also very intimidating depending on where you are in your grief.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, I love that. Because I think small little things throughout the day are so important for everything that we're doing, presencing activities,
Yes.
all of that. And I think we can often sort of put off doing things because we think it needs to be some big thing or we need to be able to devote like half an hour to it or whatever. And what you're
Right.
describing is like, I mean, it takes seconds, right? Like
Yeah.
and it doesn't require very much of you other than just the openness and the
Yeah.
willingness to do it, and I love that so much.
Yeah. Yeah. Your brain will thank you too, because your brain likes it too. Your brain likes it.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It's creating new patterns,
Yeah.
which is really helpful.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit too about anticipatory grief, because we've touched on this a little bit, but I think this is something that a lot of people are experiencing where and don't necessarily realize that it is a grief that they're experiencing because they're like, well, my animal's here. Like, what? I don't understand. Why am I feeling this kind of way? But like when something's going on with our animal and we are expecting a particular outcome, what are some, can you describe a little bit what that looks like for somebody and what are some ways that they can support themselves as they knock this out?
Well, there's a couple things that go on around anticipatory grief that make it
Mm.
very hard. We think of anticipatory grief as all the constellation of feelings that are coming up when you are anticipating the death of your beloved. And for some people, that starts very early in their animal's life for
Mm.
maybe an early diagnosis. Maybe there's behavioral things, and then for some people, of course, they don't have as much time in that anticipatory period, or people who have multiple rounds of cancers, and that's an anticipatory period. So anticipatory grief can span a long time or a very short time. So I always just kind of like to define that. Um, and I also like to say it is sometimes coupled with ambiguous grief. And I'm particularly bringing that up here because many people who have complex dogs are also experiencing something called ambiguous grief, which I really like to name for people because it can be really helpful. The term was coined by Dr. Pauline Boss, who is a therapist. And it actually has two definitions. One, which doesn't apply here so much, but I'll tell you what it is. And that is the kind of grief we feel if we have like a natural disaster or something happens, maybe our animal runs away or goes missing, and we never quite know what happened to them, right? That's some people will call that grief without closure. Not a huge fan of the word closure, but is that where we don't know what happened kind of thing. That's one definition. But the other definition is when our animal or a human is no longer quite themselves in a certain way. So in humans, we might think of this as a dementia experience. We might be experiencing ambiguous grief when we're supporting someone with their dementia, Parkinson's, addiction, things like that. With our beloveds, and especially if there's anything going on with behavior, maybe behavior that has changed, or sometimes mobility. I used to have a dog that liked to go for 4 mile hikes every day, and now he can only go around the block. Well, that's a huge amount of grief adjusting to who your beloved is now. Sometimes our animals have cognitive decline, just like humans, and we're going through that experience. And so I always like to name for people that there is also this ambiguous grief that sometimes accompanies anticipatory grief, and it's a little different. And if you're going through it, it's real. And there are things to mourn about that. Hopes and dreams are part of mourning that. Things that will never come again are part of mourning that, and really allowing yourself to feel that grief and move with that grief, right? Because that's very real. Now, anticipatory grief can feel like all kinds of things. It can feel like, I don't want to live in a world without my beloved, like I was just saying about Arnie. I don't think I'll ever be happy again. I want to fight and I want to do everything I can and get every possible treatment. Or sometimes anticipatory grief might feel like, I just want it to be over. I want some relief from this struggle, which makes me feel like a horrible person or horrible guardian. All the stability, all the love, all the gifts that my beloved has given me are going to be gone once they're gone. I feel unseen. I feel uncertain. I feel afraid. I feel angry. I feel powerless. I have so much dread. When is it going to change? Is it going to change? Um, do I have to be here all the time? Do I have to keep vigil and watch? Can I go to my niece's graduation? Because what if something happens? So I mean, these are just all the kinds of things. People in anticipatory grief are facing huge challenges. They're facing medical decisions, which are complicated and complex very much. They might be facing a euthanasia decision, which can be very, very hard. They might be facing logistical challenges with their animals, with how to kind of manage them or keep them physically safe in their house, gating and creating areas if the animal's having problems physically. There's certainly financial pieces that are coming up for a lot of people in anticipatory grief. And a lot of caregiving. If you are doing sub-Q fluids, if you're doing medicated baths, if you're cleaning up because of incontinence, if you're working with harnesses or wheelchairs or any of that, there's a lot of physical labor on top of all of these other emotional pieces. So it's huge. Spiritual pieces, social pieces. It's a big, complex storm, and in some ways, for some people, even more intense than their post-loss grief.
Thank you for naming all of those different examples of it as well, because I think that we overlook that that's all part and parcel of this whole experience. I mean, whether or not you can go out with your friends, or whether or not it's even okay for you to be having fun, for you to laugh when you've got this kind of situation going. I mean, all of that. And I think kind of off the back of that, something that I think is really brilliant about what you share on Instagram is also recognizing the social component of all of this, of like holidays, for example, or like those expectations where we've got something going on in the wider social sphere. And we're often told like to get over it, or you shouldn't be feeling a certain way, or people are uncomfortable with our big emotions, and so they try to shift that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that kind of looks like and how people can sort of support themselves through that social pressure component of grief.
Well, certainly on the anticipatory side, many people I work with, and on Instagram, I get messages all the time about this. They get comments from people or judgment from people, very often direct, like, well, you spend too much time looking after your dog. Or don't you want to be able to live again? Won't it be nice when you're freed up to travel? These are real statements that my clients have shared with me. That, your choices and the way you're choosing to care for your beloved in their sickness or in their challenge is somehow wrong. And so, one of the things we want to be reminding ourselves about all grief, but on that side of things, is that there is no right or wrong way. What you choose to do in terms of you caring for your beloved is your prerogative. And nobody knows the value of your beloved to your life. Nobody knows the depth of your relationship and what that beloved has done for you. And I I know the kinds of relationships that my clients have oftentimes are way more powerful and deeper than any relationship they have with any human. And that is a-okay and that is valid. And so people who are making judgments about how you're choosing to spend your time or care for your beloved, they don't know. And it's not their place to say. So that is on the anticipatory side, you get a lot of that kind of judgment. And then on the post loss side, of course, there's all kinds of things that come up. When are you going to get another one? Or, aren't you glad you're not having to go to the vet 3 times a week? People just say hideous things. We live in a grief avoidant, death avoidant culture. Nobody knows what to say. Most people just want to fix it. Don't cry, stiff upper lip, right? And everything people say is usually all about them. It's not about you. It's all about their discomfort and inability to actually just show up and hold the space for you. And people who love you and care about you, even if they're well intentioned, oftentimes just want to fix it. They don't want to see you sad. So they don't, it's just, it's a lot of social ickiness around this. Like I said before, what do we know about grief? Virtually nothing, right? So people don't know how to show up and support. They don't know what to do or say to be helpful. And a lot of times they end up saying the wrong thing. And here's what I like to say to people about when people say the wrong thing or dismissive comment. And I do talk about this on Instagram all the time. And I'm always posting, um, you know, responses you can say and things you can, ways you can steer the conversation. But the thing is, there's kind of I think there's 2 categories of people. One is a category of people, if they say something to you that's just totally crappy, consider, is this consistent? Is this actually someone, do you have a cousin who just always says crappy things to you? Well, you know what? Then this is actually who they are about everything. And your dog isn't any different than that. And we just may want to reevaluate their presence in our life in general, right? Because a lot of times people who say something bad, they always say bad stuff. And if that's the case, we just might want to reevaluate our boundaries with that person in general. Then you got the category of people who it's they don't usually say crappy things. They usually know how to show up and they are just boneheaded. And those are the situations where I do think with time and maybe not immediately in the moment, you can sort of, explain, hey, that felt really hurtful. This is what would sound supportive to me, try to help teach them a little bit. And I hate putting any burden on grievers. We shouldn't have to do any extra work. We're already grieving. We're exhausted. However, because this is a disenfranchised grief and our culture is so bad with grief and loss and death and support, sometimes it's nice to be able to say, it would have felt more supportive to me if you could just ask me to tell a story about Arnie and I could share a story about our life together, right? Or whatever you want to say there. So I think whenever you get a crappy comment, you got to consider the source and their behavior pattern, and then kind of, what might feel good to you to do about it. And it doesn't mean you have to do anything in the moment. You can do that in a couple months if you want.
I love that. That's really helpful. Thank you for sharing that. And I agree with you, pointing back again to the lack of support that we have in our culture more generally. I think it's one of the true, to be honest, I think it's one of the illnesses of our society is that we don't have rituals around all of the huge life milestones, all of the rites of passage that we inevitably go through. We don't have anything to support it, and we don't learn, like you're saying, we learn from a very young age, don't talk about it, or it's a bad thing. And not to really do the comparison thing, but I am kind of going to do it, where we can see there are examples in other cultures where they do have
Yes.
those kinds of ceremonies, where they do
Yeah.
create those supports, where they do take time out to grieve, and they honor the entire process of it. We are
Yeah.
deeply, deeply both lacking and devoid and desiring all of that. We just don't know where to turn for it.
Totally. We also, in our culture, we're just obsessed with acquiring. We are all about acquiring more, 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 gain, gain, gain. And when it comes talking about loss, unless it's weight loss, we don't even want to think about it or talk about it. Any kind of loss, right? So that's another huge obstacle because we're so obsessed with acquiring. It's
That's a
huge.
really great point. Yeah, I agree with you. I agree there. And it is to our detriment because we are going to experience these human things and we need support in doing that. We really do.
Totally. Yeah, a lot of people I work with too. I always ask people, like, have you had any other significant human or animal losses before? And many people I work with have not. They really haven't had what they would consider a major significant loss. And so for a lot of people I work with, because a lot of people I work with is they got their first dog in their early 20s, after college. And this has been the dog that's been with them through their 20s and 30s. And, now their time has ended earthside, and this is the first time that my client is experiencing any kind of big loss. So a lot of people just feel really unprepared. They're like, I don't know how
Mhm.
to do this. My grandma died when I was 7, but I don't, that wasn't really my grief experience. And what I have learned now, I've been doing this long enough that I have many clients come back to me years later and say, wow, my mom just died. And the work we did together, I incorporated so many of those rituals and connections and um, the tools that we learned, and it really helped me about my mom. Or I had a client recently who went through a major health crisis, and after she came out on the other side of that, she wanted to do a session to tell me about all the ways she'd used the tools for grief for that. So I do think like getting a foundation about grief and you know what my grief can be like and what it feels like, and validating your grief and getting tools and resources and support, we know we're going to have more grief in life. Grief is going to keep coming. A lot of people say, "How do you see grief? Do you see grief as a enemy?" I'm like, "No, I see grief as a friend. I want to invite grief to the table because my grief's going to be hanging out with me the rest of my life,
That's right.
and it's going to come in different ways." And sometimes it's going to feel like the weird auntie you don't want to sit next to at Thanksgiving because she's going to talk about a lot of topics that you don't want to hear. But nevertheless, we got to kind of find a way to make a space for grief at our table and not view it as a threat or, something we need to rid ourselves of, but
Mm.
someone we're going to carry along with us
Mhm.
for our whole life.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, when you grieve really hard, it's an indicator that you've loved really hard too. And that's the beautiful thing. That's part of what we're here for. And I've shared this story before on the podcast, but a really dear friend of mine had a dog that was a soul dog for him. And in fact, he even had this experience where he feels like that the dog was a reincarnation of a past dog, that they had a soul
Yep.
contract. And
Yes.
during the kind of second life, the dog developed the same cancer that his previous dog had developed. And he
Oh,
had a little bit of this reoccurring thing of he felt like he waited too long with the first dog to make the decision to put him down. And the dog actually, he had a osteosarcoma and
yep.
broke his leg as a result of it. And so my friend saw the dog in so much pain and was like, I'm not going to be doing that again. And so was talking directly to his dog now about, you need to let me know when the right time is, because I don't want to wait that long. And he would have a lot of these really deep conversations with his dog. That was the nature of their relationship. But I do
Yep.
think this is something that we can kind of cultivate more generally with our animals, is that kind of conversation with them and include
Yep.
them in some of these decision making processes, which we can talk about. But
Yeah.
something that he learned when he did make the decision to do the euthanasia, and he said on his drive back from the vets, he was like driving past this field, and he just had this sense of like expansion and love.
Mm.
And he said he very distinctly heard from his dog, don't be heartbroken, be heartbroken open. And that was so beautiful. It was so helpful for him. And he
Yeah.
related to me, and I've related to other people since then, of it's not about denying our grief. And this was something that was very clear in the kind of conversation I was having with my friend, that it wasn't about get over it. It was recognize that when it feels right, you will feel that actually that sense of heartbreak that would often crumble you. And I kind of have this like visual of it, like making you smaller, contracting, can actually be that opportunity to really expand. And part of what was helpful for him is that because he's open to the spiritual stuff, he notices
Yeah.
things. His dog is able to like actually come in spirit form more often around him. And he notices things
Hmm.
like things will be out of place that the dog used to knock all the time, that kind of a thing. And
Hmm.
now
Awesome.
that used to be a bit triggering, like a little bit like it would bring the sadness up, but now it brings like such total joy. And he's able to say like, hey, I see that you're there. Like, come join us or what, like, so recognizing that the dog is still part of his life very much, just in a different form. And as a
Mm-hmm.
result of him sort of embracing this experience with his dog, he has become so much more expansive in himself, which I think is really
Yes.
beautiful. So again, that kind of lesson that they're showing us, that translates beyond the experience with the dog, but into his whole kind of way of being in the world. It's really beautiful. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, that's a beautiful story. And you're on my Instagram. I talk all the time. Like my number one goal for anybody I work with, and for anybody who's grieving a beloved at all, is that they have a continued relationship and a continued connection. And I say this all the time, and I mean it every time I say it. I feel closer to Arnie today than I did when he died 6 years ago, because our relationship has continued to evolve and expand and function in all these new and interesting ways that were not part of our earthside experience, and I'm so grateful for it.
Yeah.
And by the way, like, this is spiritual and it's also grief theory. There's a grief theory called continuing bonds. I did not invent this. Right? And there's a lot of study that shows that having these ongoing relationships, however we do it, because it can look different for everybody, is very supportive to grief. And that's really important. And add that spiritual layer if that speaks to you, of being able to communicate, being able to receive signs, being able to send signs and communicate through all these other spiritual tools that we're probably going to talk about. That is so comforting and so empowering, and helps you feel like you are doing things with your beloved. You see me talk on Instagram all the time about collaborating with your beloved. What are you going to do to collaborate today? What are we going to do today? And that becomes second nature when you feel like you have this ongoing connection and these ongoing rituals and these ongoing kind of interactions, which are so powerful and so helpful. And if it doesn't feel that way in the beginning, I also like to remind people to remain open, because many times in early grief, we are so bogged down with guilt and pain and discombobulation, it can be very hard to receive signs. Now, many people do, like on the day of, they get some big sign, or but I also just like to remind people to also give their grief some time to move with them, because it can take some time to kind of feel more open to receiving and to receive. I work with a lot of people who felt like they didn't get any signs for like 6 months or a year, and then they did. So that's very
Yeah.
common. I always like to validate that, because a lot of people are like, it's day 2. Why don't I have a sign? And then they think they're doing it wrong. And then we're in that loop again.
Exactly. Exactly. No, this is perfect too, to be able to talk about different ways that people can connect. So what are
Mhm.
some ways, if you don't mind sharing, that you feel like you've deepened that connection with Arnie for yourself? And
Yeah.
what are some ways that you have recommended to clients to actually start that communication process?
Well, in terms of, me personally, it really has changed so much with time, because the things I did in the beginning are not really things I do anymore, which is really interesting. And something I like to say to people is that we got to be really flexible with our grief. And we don't want to get so rigid that the rituals we're doing in like month 6 have to be the rituals we're going to do forever. So it's always this fine balance, especially if you're, little type A, high expectation, you want to do it all the things. You got to always be mindful that as your life shifts and changes, your connection points are going to shift and change. So we got to be flexible at all times about these rituals. In the beginning, I found it helpful, and I encourage my clients to really just keep an open dialogue going. And I encourage that to happen verbally out loud. It's a different brain process when you talk out loud as opposed to talk to yourself. So talk out loud, talk in present tense, talk to your beloved as you would as if they were here. It's going to feel good to your brain, to your neurons who are used to doing that anyway. And it can help you see places where you really enjoy having conversations. A lot of my clients love having conversations in the car with their beloved. They love going on walks. I say, go on a walk with your beloved, even if they're not earthside. Take a leash with you, take a toy with you, take a crystal with you, and talk to them, about the other dogs you're seeing, and embody their POV and be like, oh, how do you see that dog today? Is that a dog you might want to be friends with, or are we going to like steer clear? Whatever it is, have that ongoing conversation is one of the best things we can do, in the beginning. Again, low maintenance. You don't have to do much to be doing that. But I also, when your beloved is here or was here, you had a lot of communication with them that didn't involve words. You could match their energy, you could look into their eyes, and you sometimes might feel like you heard something, or you might see kind of an image coming, or you might feel something. that is all still there. It's all still there with you and your beloved. So also experiment with some wordless kind of things. Okay, if you're just going to like tune in and connect and imagine your beloved is there before you, what do you hear? What do you see? What do you feel? What do you receive? Right? I love asking our beloveds, what can I release today? Can you help me release anger? Can you help me release need for control? Can you help me release sorrow? And then asking, could you help me receive today maybe a sign? Could you help me receive a belly laugh? Could you help me receive self-compassion? Right? They've always been your guide and friend and compass. Why would that change now? It just doesn't. I believe Arnie is helping me and guiding me all the time. And when I need help, I ask him, and he usually shows up. I'm also a huge fan of other kinds of ways to connect. Tarot is a tool I use with many of my clients in my private community. I give tarot workshops, and we have a whole forum in my private community just about tarot and connecting with our beloveds through tarot. And so tarot combined with journaling is great. For dog people, if you've never explored tarot, this is like we are living in the best time ever in terms of having amazing decks and resources. There's beautiful decks about dogs specifically. There's beautiful animal related tarot and oracle decks. So I'm a huge, huge fan of using tarot. Now, if anyone out there is like not tarot open because you think you have to be psychic, this is not true. You do not need to be psychic or intuitive to read tarot. Tarot is a system that anyone can learn. And I believe we can use tarot to empower us in our grief and connect with our beloveds. So a lot of my clients, are talking to their beloveds and receiving from their beloveds through tarot and Reiki. Many people have an interest in Reiki, learning some basic Reiki. You can do with your beloved now while they're here, or you can do it after they have crossed over, whatever works for you. Reiki, dowsing, sometimes learning new skills in grief, whether it's anticipatory grief or post-loss grief, is great for our brains, gives our brains a break, opens up new areas. So that's another way to connect. A huge way I love connecting spiritually is through music. Singing to your beloved, humming. There's all this interesting research. I won't bore you with it about why singing and humming is good for our brains and good for staying present. So I love communicating through music and calling them in through music. I tell everybody I work with, get an up-tempo theme song for your beloved. and if you have a down tempo, that's okay too, or a transition song, but have songs that remind you of your beloved. And if you don't have one now, figure one out. I've had some of the most delightful songs appear. And actually, I have a whole Honoring Our Animals Spotify with playlists with these songs because it's so cool. So I love music and kind of feeling spiritually connected through music. And also meditation. Not everyone is a fan of meditation, and grief and meditation can be hard. Highly recommend guided meditations in grief as opposed to just let your thoughts, sit with your thoughts, because that sometimes doesn't feel so good in grief. But guided meditations with your beloved, if they're earthside or after they've transitioned, meditate and connect in during that meditation can feel really powerful. And then a lot of people find a lot of comfort in reading, learning more about spiritual topics. Learn more about soul contracts if you don't know about that. Maybe learn more about astrology or crystals, anything that might interest you that you can then relate back in to your beloved. Very, very powerful. So I'm a big fan of exploring new tools during grief, exploring things maybe you haven't tried before, and just coming always with the perspective, how can this connect and grow my relationship to my beloved? Now, for me personally, these days, I'm very busy. I have a lot going on. I got a family. I got my work, my private practice, got my Instagram. I'm on podcast. But for me, a lot of times with Arnie, anytime I go to like an appointment, I have to go to physical therapy today. If I get there a couple minutes early, every single time before an appointment, instead of getting on my phone, I just close my eyes, I tune in, and I check in with Arnie. And it's time I get to spend with him. That's always a ritual I have, like just a few minutes before an appointment. Also, this might sound funny, but you asked, the dentist, my dental appointments are time I view as hangout time with Arnie. I sit back in the chair, they're working on my teeth, I zone out, and Arnie and I, we just have a great conversation. And that's always dedicated Arnie time. And I know this sounds funny, but I'm a mom, I'm working with clients. I don't have a lot of spare time these days. And so anytime I have like that, or I can choose to connect, I'm connecting. So I would say always be connecting. Don't judge how or when that is. It doesn't have to be a perfectly set up altar and I'm sitting before it. That doesn't have to be that way. I love a pretty altar, by the way, but you got to be creative and inventive in your grief too. So anytime you can connect, always be connecting. That's how I see it.
I love that. I love I love that you go to the dentist and you do that. That makes the dentist so much better, to be honest. If you're like, you can look forward to something that's really horrible. At least for me, I hate going to the dentist, and making it into like a special connection time is perfect.
Total. I know. And again, like that would not be something that would come to mind. But my biggest like takeaway for anyone like hearing that is like this is a mindset. The mindset just becomes Arnie and I are doing our thing. We're going to make time to check in when it's good for both of us. And, when I want time with him, it's not like I have to make it special. It's like we're always doing it and we take our moments. And I
Mhm.
think if you can get into that mindset early in your grief that, yeah, we're going to keep doing this thing. He's going to keep teaching me. I'm going to keep giving to him. He's going to keep, showering me with insights and support and love. If you believe that, and then you're just in the mindset, then absolutely the dentist is going to be a space you can connect. So yeah, get that mindset going.
I love it. I love it so much. That's really helpful, Beth. I also wondered, as we're sort of connecting with our animals that have crossed over, thinking about things like when we've had to make some of the more difficult decisions, like euthanasia or even behavioral euthanasia, which
Mhm.
brings its own set of complexities. I wondered if you could talk about how we support ourselves through that, and actually how we can have those same sorts of conversations with our animals when they've passed, to support us in our grief and the guilt and the shame and all the complex things that comes up when we've had to make the decision that ends their life.
Yeah. Well, listen, there's no one, virtually no one I've worked with. I just did a post about this week. Um, whoever feels like 100% awesome about their euthanasia decision. And I'm saying that because it's very rarely something that any of us just feel fantastic about. And I think that's helpful to hear. Because I do think, and especially social media narrative, we see these beautiful last day bucket lists and the peaceful ending and all of that. And that is great if you can do it. But let me tell you, I work all day, every day. I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of clients. That's not most people's experience. And a lot of euthanasias have a lot leading up to them that are very hard, very complex. Oftentimes, the circumstances around the euthanasia itself is not ideal for one reason or another. Um, and sometimes things even happen during the euthanasia that are really challenging. So I first just want to say to everyone, like, it's unlikely you're going to feel fantastic about it. And sometimes that's a nice weight off, right? That we no longer have to feel the pressure that we have to feel perfect about it. And when I work with people in anticipatory grief, the euthanasia decision is something that we work on together. It's not a decision I can make. Euthanasia is a medical decision, and it's not my decision to make, but I help people talk through it. So, hopefully, if we've done good work on the anticipatory side, we're going to be entering that decision not feeling so guilty and so awful and all of that. However, I've also never worked with a client who doesn't feel guilt in some way about their situation, regardless of the circumstances. Certainly, there are certain types of deaths that we feel maybe more responsible for on the euthanasia side. But the truth is, anyone who makes a euthanasia decision, anyone who's cared for a beloved, feels guilty about not doing enough, or maybe they could have tried something else, or maybe if they just spent more money, or maybe they could have ended the suffering sooner. It's an endless woulda, coulda, shoulda. So, how do we cope with that? And how do we bring our beloved in to cope with that? It's a great question. It can sometimes be a very tough thing to do alone, which is why I really do remind people there's a lot of support out there. And I do encourage people who are really feeling drowning in the guilt and the woulda, coulda, shoulda, and the replaying of the last day and all that. That is a great clue when you want to reach out to someone like me or any mental health professional. Make sure they have a lot of good tools for guilt. That's a question I want you to ask anyone you're thinking of working with, because you sometimes need help with your guilt, because the guilt can be very overwhelming and get you very stuck. But if you're working through guilt on your own, number one, that self compassion practice I mentioned start working with your self compassion. Start checking yourself the way you talk to yourself. Am I talking to myself like I would talk to a friend? Or am I saying things that are kind of unkind? Am I reminding myself that I'm an imperfect human with flaws and that that's okay? Really start welcoming in self compassion. That's going to be your number one antidote to your guilt. Another antidote to your guilt are facts. See, what's happening with your guilt is your inner critic is getting involved, and she's getting into having a real field day about the guilt and finding all different ways to make you feel bad about it. but she's not really working with facts and evidence. And sometimes our guilt gets so hyper focused on one little tiny thing we didn't do, like eat the blueberries, is that we don't zoom out to think about what we did do. So, a powerful question for your guilt, because 99% of our guilt is about what we didn't do. Go back and talk to your beloved about what I did do. You can write a letter to your beloved. Well, I didn't feed you the blueberries, but here's what I did do. Right.
Mhm.
And remind yourself all that you did do. Remind yourself the facts of the situation. Remind yourself of the facts you had at the time, going back to the crystal ball problem. Remind yourself and ask your beloved to help you remember the facts at the time. You can also ask your beloved to write you a letter from their POV about what happened in their voice. See what they have to say about it. Because, see, most of the time when we get a guilty thought or a self critical thought, it's not true. You said this earlier. It's a very good point. And so we want to double check when we get a thought like that. Hey, Arnie, is that true? And let him answer. Or write from him to you about that. Also, this is a great time to bring in a trusted friend, someone who loves you and cares about you. Talk through the situation, express your guilt. And if you want to have that conversation, I would ask that friend to just hold the space for you and not give you feedback until you've said your whole story. Just say everything. Say everything you feel guilty about, all the things you wish you could have done differently. Let your friend really listen and absorb it, and then ask for their feedback. Ask their perspective on what you think you did wrong or what you think you could have done differently. And choose someone that, who loves you and whose opinion you think matters, someone who you would be happy to counsel if they were having the same struggle, and get their objective opinion. The thing about your guilt is that it's not always telling you the truth. Now, sometimes it is. Sometimes there are circumstances where we really did do something wrong and we made a mistake because we're humans. And unlike our beloveds who don't make many mistakes, we make a lot of mistakes. So, yeah, we might do something we wish we hadn't done, or we might have had an accident. And we can do our best to learn from that, understand what we would do differently in the future if we had a similar situation, and we can make an amends for it. It's okay to make an amends to your beloved, even after they've transitioned. And feel free to ask them, what would help clear this with you? Now, they might say, you don't need to clear this with me. I'm cool. And if they do, you're good. But maybe you do need to make an amends. And for some people, that's writing an apology letter. For some people, that's making a donation in their beloved's name to a local shelter. For some people, that's, finding another kind of ritual that would feel supportive. A lot of amends are done through ritual with my clients. We come up with kind of amends rituals, and those can feel really good. But here's the thing. Most of the time in your guilt, the amends doesn't go to your beloved. It really, and I will use the word should here, it should be going to yourself. Because the level of, bullying and meanness you've put on yourself in your guilt is so cruel, and it's adding to your suffering. Let me tell you what you don't need more of when you're grieving. You don't need more suffering. You don't need more pain. You don't. You're in enough pain. So, a way to honor your beloved and the life and the gifts and the guidance and the wisdom that they've shown you by not being judgmental with you, by accepting you as you are, by showing you love and showing you lightness and showing you grace. You can bring all those gifts back to yourself in your guilt. Treat yourself the way your beloved would treat you about it, and that will help you through.
Oh, that's so helpful. Thank you, Beth. And I agree with you 100% that it's that whole notion that forgiveness is not a practice about the other person. It's always about ourselves. And really showing ourselves, like you mentioned, you use the word grace, and I think it's really true and apropos of giving ourselves the same kind of grace that we would give anyone else. We would give anyone else. And you've said about would you talk to a friend like that? I've heard it mentioned, even to make it more sort of powerful, would you talk to a 5-year-old in pain like that?
Mm-hmm.
And recognize that 5-year-old who's in pain within you is crying out for that love and support, and so doesn't need the lecture, doesn't need the shaming or any of the other stuff that we do to ourselves. They need us to show up fully for ourselves and with total compassion. So it's a really good reminder. It's a hard thing to do in the moment, in our culture in particular, but I think we need to hear it over and over and over again, so that at some point it sticks in there and we recognize that that's where all of the healing starts. It starts with ourselves, with loving ourselves.
Yeah, and listen, this issue, of why you feel so guilty and why your critical voice is so loud about this didn't start with your beloved, and it didn't start with this death. This started a long time ago. And it doesn't matter why. I don't care about why it started. And it may have been a good coping mechanism for you, given what was going on in your life. It might have been a survival mechanism, and you achieving and having that critical voice to motivate you, that might have helped you get out of a situation and excel. And that might have served you well. But we all come to a point where we got to say, hey, am I going to keep being so mean to myself? And the answer is no.
Yeah. This is the big part of the healing journey.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that this is, from my own kind of spiritual perspective or the lessons that I've learned, I do think that this is a big part of why we even choose to come and have the human experience. It is I don't think healing is about fixing. I think that's a misconception that we have in our culture, but it's very much about, you refer to the tarot as something that's a tool that anyone can pick up and use. And I fully agree with that. And one of the reasons I think that it is so powerful is because it's a system of archetypes. It's
Yes.
referring to all of the big milestones that we go through in our human experience. And even
Mm-hmm.
from kind of like a Jungian perspective with like shadow work and recognizing all those full archetypes, the
Mm-hmm.
point of shadow work is not to get rid of the shadow. The point of the shadow work is to integrate, it's to welcome it in. So, like you
Mm-hmm.
were saying about inviting grief to your table and recognizing they're going to be there for a long time. So, you might as well start a conversation with them. That's a good thing. It's not something we just kind of have to get through, but it's integrating the fullness of who we are, the light and dark of who we are. And that is it's so much a part of why, in my perspective, why we even chose to incarnate into this weird earthly experience. And so as much as we can be open to all of that and embrace all of that, I think it makes all of the processes that we go through easier, or at least it gives us a different perspective on it when we're going through it.
My favorite word that you use there is integrate. I love that word for grief, as I do believe this is something we learn to integrate. Initially, we've got to adjust to it. We have to adjust to the loss, adjust to the grief being present. And then, you know, as we continue to move with it, we integrate it in. So it is a part of us. It's every bit a part of us as our beloved's gifts, guidance, lessons, and teachings, right? Grief does come with its own set of gifts, guidance, lessons, and teachings. And we can resist those all we want. But for my money, we're a whole lot better off to invite them in and allow them to be part of our experience. Because again, more grief is coming. More grief is coming for all of us. And I think that's, when we bring home our puppy on day one or our rescue animal, whenever we get them, we're not thinking about goodbye. We're not thinking this is going to be over. We don't think about it. And the truth is, as my pet loss grief counselor used to always say to me, your goodbye begins on day one with your beloved, your earthside goodbye, anyway. And I think if we all can be mindful of that and just say, this part of our relationship will be here for however long, we don't get to choose, right? And then the next part will continue, that we start to just feel a lot more comfortable. Like, okay, this is a thing that's going to happen. You'd be surprised how many people call me and say, I know this sounds funny, but I would die. And that's real for a lot of people. So
Yeah.
even just saying that out loud is big.
Yeah. That's so helpful. Thank you for that, Beth. I wanted to ask you one last question that I ask all of my guests. And that is, maybe you want to think about Arnie in particular, but what do you feel like animals? I always ask kind of related to dogs, but I also broaden it around animals more generally. What do you feel like they've taught you about what it means to be human?
Well, it's, I mean, every day I get to witness the impact that animals, and especially soulmate animals, have on my clients. Um, as a whole, I know that worthiness is a powerful thing that our animals impart to us. They help us feel worthy of love, of success, of attention, of praise. And I don't know that worth is an inherent part of being human rather. But if you don't feel worthy as a human, it makes our time here really hard. And Arnie helped me feel worthy of acceptance and love and non-judgment. Arnie made me feel good enough, regardless of what I achieved or didn't achieve, or what I looked like or didn't look like, or any of the metric standards of success, in quotes. And so I think a huge gift that all animals can be here is to remind us that we are allowed to be loved, nurtured, and accepted exactly as we are.
Oh, that's beautiful. And what a legacy Arnie's left. That's really wonderful.
I
Thank
appreciate it. Thank you, Arnie.
Thank you for sharing that. Beth, if people want to work with you, if they want to learn more, if they're curious about what grief counseling might look like for them in regards to pet loss, where can they find more information about you?
I encourage anybody listening to, first of all, come over to my Instagram at Honoring Our Animals. We have great conversations going on over there. I post twice a day, different content related to all aspects of grief. So please come over, follow, check out my content. I've got lots of things there for you to explore and resources. I do also do a monthly live memorial service to honor all of our beloveds, regardless of when they've transitioned. You can look out for the call for names for that. You can submit your beloved's name, and I will read your name next to your beloved's, along with other beloveds that we are honoring in my monthly service. It's a beautiful time to come together, to hear your beloved celebrated in a public way, and to be with other grievers who are experiencing their own challenges. I also have a section in that memorial service for any animals who are having a struggle or a challenge or a sickness. So even if you have a living animal who's going through a hard time and you'd like some extra energy and love and prayers sent for them, we do that in the service too. So feel free to submit for that. I also have a weekly newsletter that I put out with both anticipatory and post loss tips, little digestible bites of empowerment and inspirational things. So that is another great free resource you can find via my Instagram or my website. My website is honoringouranimals.com. And if you are thinking of working with me either in a one-on-one capacity or in a small cohort group, and you want to become a part of my community, I'd be happy to chat with you about that. I do complimentary consultations so that we can have a chat, see if we're going to be a good fit to work together. And you can reach out to me anytime via my Instagram or my website to get that scheduled and see how we can help you through this time. It's a tough time when you're grieving or you're anticipating a loss or you're going through decision making, and you don't have to go through it alone. So I'd love to walk the road with you if you feel like I'd be a good fit for you. So I think that's all the ways to find me. Instagram and my website, the main ways.
That's perfect. Thank you for that. And I'll leave all those links in the show notes as well, so you can click directly from there. But this has just been such a gift. Thank you for sharing your time, your energy, your wisdom. I know this is such an important topic. And again, like we said, there's not a lot of conversations going on around this. So I love that we've created a space where I hope that people feel like they've been seen, that they've been heard, that they know that they're not alone through this. And as Beth and I have both said, if you are struggling, please reach out. That's the important thing to do, is to not isolate ourselves in our grief necessarily, but to find the appropriate community that can support us. So thank you so much for having this conversation with us today. I'm so grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this beautiful conversation with Beth Bigler of Honoring Our Animals. I hope you found this helpful. Like Beth and I talked about, it can be so difficult when we don't have the supportive spaces and resources to help us in our very individual grieving and mourning processes. And I hope this chat was helpful to you in some way. If you're looking for support with your pet loss grief journey and you'd like to talk to Beth and see how she and her offerings might be able to support you, please visit her website, honoringouranimals.com. And that's honoring spelled the American way. So it's HONORING, our animals, which is OURANIMALS.com. I have that link in the show notes, so you can just click from there. But you can also follow her on Instagram with her handle Honoring Our Animals, same spelling. She's really active there and shares lots of helpful, supportive tips, so definitely check it out. Now, Beth and I talked about the value of using tarot as a tool for reflection and connection, and I absolutely agree. Tarot is one of my go-to tools for myself, and I use it all the time with clients. The tarot is really about the archetypal journey that we all go through as humans, and because of that, it can offer a window and wisdom into how we can best traverse the things that we're inevitably going to deal with in life. I've been toying with the idea of putting together something like a webinar or a short course on intuitive tarot. Now, intuitive tarot means that it's not about memorizing a bunch of meanings of the cards, but actually using tarot as a tool for your own self-exploration and self-healing journeys. And in doing so, it becomes really useful for exploring all aspects of our relationship with our pets, both living and crossed over. And I just wondered, would you be interested in something like a webinar or a short course where you get on Zoom with me and we learn a bit about how to use the tarot to connect and support yourself and your relationship with your pets? Would that be helpful and fun? Let me know and I'll look at putting something together for you guys. So again, you can DM me on Instagram at Mystic Dog Mama or contact me through my website, mysticdogmama.com. Now, if you're enjoying the podcast, I would be so grateful if you would consider subscribing and leaving a review on Apple Podcast. I wish that Spotify had that option, but right now only Apple does. But reviews are so helpful for me to know not only what you're enjoying so that I can make sure to create content that you're finding helpful, but the reviews also really help others to find the podcast and find the support that they're looking for in this beautiful, beautiful community that we're creating together. You guys are just so amazing, and I am so grateful for each and every one of you. Okay, on that little soppy note, until next time.